Have you ever faced a time in your life when it felt like everything was falling apart? When the weight of the world seemed too heavy to carry, and hope seemed like a distant dream? What do you do when you've tried everything, and you still can't see a way out? These are the moments that test us, that stretch us, and that demand something more from us, something deep within that we may not even know exists. For one widow in a small town, the weight of her circumstances was unbearable. Her husband had died, leaving her with nothing but debts she couldn't pay. The creditors were coming, and the only way she could see out of it was to lose her 2 sons. The thought of it broke her heart. She had already lost so much: her husband, the person who had shared her life, her dreams, and her struggles. And now, she was about to lose her sons as well. She felt like she had no one left, no hope in sight. As she sat in the quiet of her home, the reality of her situation weighed on her chest like a heavy stone. She could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, and yet, time seemed to be standing still. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her, suffocating her with the pressure of what was to come. But even in the midst of her darkest hour, there was a flicker of something. Something small, something that might have easily been overlooked, a whisper of hope. She had heard stories about Elisha, the prophet, the one who spoke with the authority of God, whose words carried the power to change lives. She didn't know how or why, but something within her stirred. Maybe Elisha could help her. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out of this. With trembling hands, she wiped away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. She stood, straightened her posture, and walked to the door. The weight of her decision felt heavy, but the thought of doing nothing was far heavier. She had nothing left to lose, and so she set out, seeking the one person who might offer her a glimmer of hope. When she arrived at Elisha's house, she didn't know what to expect. She had heard of his miracles, of the mighty works that God had done through him. But how could someone like her, just a poor widow with nothing to offer, receive help? How could God possibly help her when she was so undeserving, so far from perfect? Elisha greeted her with a calm, knowing look, as if he understood everything that was happening in her heart. It wasn't judgment she saw in his eyes, but compassion. A compassion that seemed to pierce through her pain and speak to the very depths of her soul. "How can I help you?" Elisha asked, his voice calm and steady. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of her circumstances. "My husband, your servant, is dead," she said, her voice breaking. "And you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. What am I to do?" Elisha listened to her words carefully, his gaze unwavering. He didn't rush to speak, as if he were waiting for the right moment, the right answer. He understood her desperation, but he also understood something deeper, something that she didn't yet see. There was a way forward, but it required something from her, faith. "What do you have in your house?" Elisha asked, his voice steady, but full of quiet urgency. She hesitated, looking around at the empty space of her home. It wasn't much, just the bare essentials, just the remnants of a life that had been drained of its joy. "Nothing at all, except a small jar of oil," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elisha's eyes brightened with understanding. A small jar of oil, seemingly insignificant, almost useless. But to God, it was more than enough. It was more than she could see in that moment, but Elisha saw the potential. He saw the miracle that could be birthed from her faith, even if it was as small as a mustard seed. "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars," he instructed her. "Don't ask for just a few. Then, go inside, shut the door behind you, and pour the oil into all the jars." The widow blinked in confusion. "But I only have this one small jar. How can I fill all the jars?" Elisha's response was simple, yet powerful. "Go, and do as I say." Her mind raced with doubt. Could this really work? Could this little jar of oil fill all those jars? She didn't know how, but she did know one thing: she had to try. She had no other option, no other hope. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and set out, determined to follow Elisha's instructions. The widow went door to door, asking her neighbors for empty jars. Some of them looked at her with pity, some with curiosity, but none of them questioned her. They could see the desperation in her eyes. One by one, she collected as many jars as she could find, large ones, small ones, and everything in between. As she returned home with the jars, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. There was something about Elisha's words, something that had stirred a flicker of faith deep inside her heart. Maybe, just maybe, God was going to show up in a way she had never expected. She closed the door behind her and set the jars in a neat row on the floor. Her sons watched from the side, their faces a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. She stood before the small jar of oil, the only thing she had left, and her heart raced. Taking a deep breath, she poured a small amount of oil into the first jar. To her amazement, the oil didn't stop. It kept flowing, filling the jar, and then the next one, and the next one after that. With each jar, the widow's faith grew stronger. The oil continued to pour, seemingly endless, as if the small jar had no limit. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with awe. She watched as the jars began to fill, one by one, until the entire room was filled with jars of oil. There was no denying it, this was a miracle. God had taken her small offering, her tiny jar of oil, and multiplied it beyond her wildest imagination. Her sons watched in disbelief, their eyes wide with wonder. They had seen their mother struggle, had heard her cry at night, and had feared the loss of their family. But now, in the midst of their uncertainty, they were witnessing something extraordinary, a sign that God had not forgotten them. Finally, when every jar in the house was filled, the widow turned to her sons, a sense of awe filling her heart. "Bring me another jar," she said, eager to see the miracle continue. But they looked at her, confused. "There are no more jars." And with that, the oil stopped. The widow stood there, her hands trembling as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. She had been part of something so much bigger than herself, something that only God could have done. She knew in that moment that God had provided for her, not just enough to pay the debts, but enough to live on. When the widow went to Elisha, she did not just have a small amount of oil. She had enough to pay off her debts and live on for the rest of her life. Elisha's words echoed in her mind, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." The weight that had pressed so heavily on her heart was lifted. She was no longer facing the loss of her sons. She was no longer bound by the fear of the creditors coming. God had seen her need, and he had provided in abundance. As she left Elisha's house, her heart was overflowing with gratitude. She could not contain the joy that filled her soul. She had trusted God, even in the midst of her darkest hour, and he had answered her in a way she could never have imagined. What can we learn from this incredible story? The widow's experience teaches us powerful lessons about faith, trust, and the provision of God. First, God sees our needs. Even when we feel invisible, he is there, watching over us. Just as the widow's cry didn't go unheard, neither do ours. In our times of desperation, we must remember that God is with us, always ready to provide. Second, God provides through our faith. The widow didn't have much to offer, but she was willing to trust God with what little she had. God multiplied her small offering and turned it into something abundant. If we are willing to trust him with what we have, he will bless us beyond what we can comprehend. Third, God's provision is often abundant. When we trust him and follow his instructions, we discover that he doesn't just meet our needs, he exceeds them. The widow's story is a reminder that when we lean on God, he will provide more than enough for us to live abundantly. Finally, trusting God leads to peace. The widow's story ended in peace, not just because her debts were paid, but because she had seen firsthand the faithfulness of God. When we trust in God, we can face any situation with a peace that surpasses all understanding. If you find yourself in a place of struggle, know this: God sees you. He knows your pain, your fear, your desperation, but he also knows the way out, and he will provide in his perfect timing. Trust him with whatever you have, no matter how small it may seem. His provision will exceed your expectations, and he will bring you through with abundance. Reflect on your own life. What small offerings can you give to God? What areas of your life are you holding onto out of fear or doubt? Let go, trust him, and watch as he works miracles in your life, just as he did for the widow. Remember, no matter how impossible your situation may seem, God is always able to make a way where there seems to be no way. Keep your faith, and let his abundance fill your life.